presentation as well. Um, in our conversations with our school division partners, there's been a lot of discussion, understandably, about the Virginia Literacy Act and its implementation that's coming up this year. And so we set about doing this research and policy brief last year, last spring, and it's been a real pleasure personally to be able to collaborate with the people who are co-presenters of this information today. I knew very little about the Virginia Literacy Act going into this, and it's been just a pleasure to be able to collaborate with everybody who's been on this project and learn from them. And as they start their presentation, I'm going to encourage them to introduce themselves as well, so we can just do the introductions along the way. I will say that nobody on this call, even though there's a ton of collective expertise of the presenters related to literacy, I would say that nobody is trying to position themselves as the authority or the absolute expert on the Virginia Literacy Act. This isn't intended to be a critique of the VLA or an endorsement of it. This is just a collection of what we learned. We're trying to summarize what we learned from this research brief process. And so we're excited about the conversation. This is also, we recognize that there's tremendous expertise of everybody who's joining this conversation today. And so as we're navigating these presentations, we're going to share a little bit about what we learned from our research and policy brief. And then Taylor Snow from Henrico County Public Schools is going to share about his implementation efforts in their school division. And if you have questions along the way, I would encourage you to put your questions into the chat. And then members of our team are going to do our best to try to answer those questions along the way. But also, because there's so much expertise in this group, would encourage you to also answer the questions along the way. This should really just be a collaborative discussion about promoting literacy in Virginia. And I'll share at the onset here that we had 175 RSVPs for this seminar, which was a record for us at MERC with our online seminars. So that would suggest that there's a lot of interest in this topic, which we're really glad to be helping to steer this conversation. But we also recognize that we're not the only ones that are thinking or talking about this. And so we should all be contributing to this conversation along the way. The Q&A is only going to be in the chat for now, but during the breakout sessions that we're having at the end, and we want to make sure we protect time for that, that's going to be a real opportunity for you to be able to jump in, ask your questions, and share resources along the way. And we'll talk about that whenever we make that transition. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started with this presentation of what we learned about the Virginia Literacy Act. So make sure everybody can see my screen. Joan, can you give me a thumbs up if you could see my screen? All right. Well, we'll get started here. So we're covering what we learned from our research and policy brief focused on understanding the Virginia Literacy Act. Here's 2 QR codes for you to be able to access the slides and resources, which we've also thrown a link in the chat for that, but also the research brief. If you wanted to go directly to that, the research brief is also available in that resource document that includes all the slides and resources. So everything that you would need to be able to kind of accompany what we're going to talk about today is available through those 2 QR codes. And Mike has been throwing that link in the chat as well to the resource document. So this is the research brief, Understanding the Virginia Literacy Act. So for this brief, we focused on trend data, which included VDOE school quality profiles. We also looked at National Assessment of Education progress scores. We also did a policy analysis, and understandably, we particularly focused on Virginia, but we also focused on Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina because they had comparable legislation that's been enacted in recent years. And so we're going to do some comparisons there. Kim's going to talk through those pieces. We also did a fairly extensive literature review, especially of recent literature, focused on science of reading, language comprehension. Mike is going to be talking through those findings from there. And then we also did a curriculum review of the approved core instructional programs. So Joan's going to be talking through some of those foundational pieces there about what's been approved for the instructional program. But for the trend data piece, I'm going to throw it over to Suzanne Alexander to share what we learned.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Suzanne Alexander. My background is in elementary education as a teacher and then as a reading specialist. I recently completed my doctoral work at VCU in the School of Education and am now serving as a reading specialist for Montgomery County Public Schools in Southwest Virginia. So we wanted to set up for you what English achievement looks like in Virginia. This chart represents changes in English achievement based on comparisons between 2019 and 2023 standardized test scores. Paired samples t-tests were used to compare the scores from the standardized tests, and this is representative of more than 1,700 schools. And note that the asterisk indicates statistical significance in this chart. If you look at the row for the average of all students, you can see that students were significantly less likely to pass their standardized tests in 2023, with a drop of 4.7% when compared to 2019 scores. You can also see that the largest subgroup declines occurred for our multilingual learners, with a drop of 6.9%, and for our Latina OX students with a drop of 6.3%. However, on the upside, all student groups were significantly more likely to show growth in their test scores in 2023 than in 2019, while Latina OX and multilingual learners were significantly more likely to do so. This table depicts average scores on the National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP, in reading for 4th and 8th grade students in Virginia, along with comparisons to the United States. Note that the change in the date range from the last chart, this chart only goes through 2022, as the 2023 data was not available yet. Similar to national trends, Virginia students declined in both 4th and 8th grade between 2019 and 2022. And it is important to note that the 10-point drop that you see here for 4th grade students in Virginia was the worst in the country, including all 50 states and 2 U.S. territories. And then in 8th grade, NAEP reading score declines. Virginia ranked 14th nationally. And also, to give you some perspective, there were no states that showed a score increase in 4th grade in 2022. And there were only 2 states, Nevada and Hawaii, that showed a score increase in 8th grade results. And then here in this chart you will find in the policy section of our research brief, but we wanted to include it here in our presentation of the data. This is a comparison in NAEP reading scores, and it's an aggregate of the 4th and 8th grade scores. And it shows the proficiency levels of states that, as Dr. Nath mentioned, have enacted similar legislation to Virginia. North Carolina is kind of on the same timeline as us and have enacted their legislation this school year. And you can see that each of these states showed a decline between 2019 and 2022. And COVID-related school disruptions were likely a contributing factor to this. Virginia, compared to the other states, looks pretty well, being the only state of the 4 to show higher than 30% proficiency levels. And it is important to note that it's difficult to draw any causal references from the enactment of the legislation, but these numbers do offer a point of comparison in terms of achievement using a common metric, the NAEP scores.
All right, and now Kim Bridges will share about policy implications.
Thanks, David, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the policy implications of the Virginia Literacy Act, but I also want to share that we're scratching the surface. We could go way deeper on policy implications, but what we decided to do, given the timeliness of the brief, was to focus on 3 states that would offer comparable policy comparisons, as well as information in the report that goes much deeper into what's actually changing in state law, because we know that oftentimes folks will hear one term like the Virginia Literacy Act and assume that that means there's one place you can go to, but not at all. This policy enacted multiple changes in state code provisions and changes that are underway still within the Virginia Department of Education. So we define what's in the Virginia Literacy Act in the report. It's as a whole, it was a bipartisan legislative effort over 2 General Assembly sessions to codify research-informed practice into state code. So these are new state laws that resulted from those 2 General Assembly sessions. They were adopted in 2022 and 2023. And as Suzanne mentioned, this is the implementation time. So what we're doing right now in school divisions across the Commonwealth is a result of both of those cycles of law changes. So within the state code, 9 different pieces of legislation, 9 different parts of the state code were changed, including provisions within the standards of quality. So 9 different education statutes had updated language. 4 of those were SOQs as we know them. And so we'll just do a quick little overview of what the SOQ specific changes were. Anybody who's really familiar with the SOQs will know off the bat, this is major legislation because it's adjusting the instructional program SOQ, SOQ1, the personnel SOQ, SOQ2, as well as instructional leadership, personnel, and planning and public involvement. So when you have changes across this many different statutes, you know that this is a comprehensive piece of legislation. The first part of the report also goes in depth into the definitions that are listed there in statute 22.1-1. And so if you haven't already, it's good to get to know up close and personal those 2 definitions of evidence-based literacy intervention, or EBLI, and science-based reading research, or SBRR, because those are the foundations for all the changes in the rest of the areas of statute. So SOQ 1 requires that division level literacy plan that so many of y'all have been involved with, I'm sure, as well as reading intervention in grades K through 3, a literacy course in grades 6 through 8 for struggling readers, and services before students can be promoted, along with parental notification when students are struggling. SOQ2 has some provisions that align with those quite well in terms of personnel requirements. A reading specialist is now required for every 550 students at the elementary level, and then those acronyms are starting to come into play here, EBLI and SBRR, training for a wide variety of personnel, not just reading specialists, but grade level teachers, content teachers, even middle school assistant principals. So there's a number of personnel that are required to have this training now because of SOQ2 and the changes made there. In the 5th SOQ, which relates to leadership and instructional personnel, there's all kinds of language around high quality professional development and provisions of technical assistance from the Virginia Department of Education, including support for literacy coaching, which should be happening as divisions need that. In SOQ 7, we have that planning and public involvement provision, and that is that there's a division level literacy plan as well as individual student level literacy plans. And those division level literacy plans are to be aligned with existing comprehensive plans, or what state statute calls it, but most divisions call these their strategic plan. So you've got a strategic plan in place at the school division level. Your literacy plan should be aligning to that. So with those provisions changed in the SOQs, and again, we're scratching the surface here, check out the report for a bit more detail on each of the ways that the SOQs and state code changed. We wanted to look at a couple of other comparable states who were just a little bit ahead of us in some cases, or significantly ahead of us in terms of state level policy change around literacy. And so we turned our attention to 3 states that we identified as having similar policies. That's Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Again, a range of how far in advance they enacted this legislation, but we were looking at similarities in the late legislative changes that they made, particularly around requiring teacher preparation programs to change, this idea of a pedagogical reading exam for teacher licensure, required PD, and having aligned curriculum and intervention materials that are part of the state oversight, as well as that intervention plan for struggling readers. So these 3 states had those similar provisions, although they had some slight differences from what Virginia Literacy Act is requiring. We found that those were comparable in terms of the major provisions of the legislation. And so we looked at what had happened since that legislation was implemented. You can see the different years that these policies were enacted. And actually, Arkansas, its original literacy legislation was more than a decade ago. The 2017 changes have been followed by another round of legislative changes as well. As Suzanne mentioned, North Carolina is interesting because they, like us, are in their year of implementation, even though you might notice that they were 1 year earlier than us in terms of legislative enactment. And so what that translates to is a whole additional year to prepare for the implementation that we can learn from. And so North Carolina was a bit ahead of us in terms of rolling out the implementation once those legislative changes were mandated. So when we looked at these provisions, we also looked at what Virginia might want to pay attention to. As we call it in the report, we wanted to look for challenges as well as opportunities. And so the things that we could see from these other states that enacted similar literacy policies at the state level were there will likely be modifications. As I mentioned, Arkansas has had at least 2 major rounds of modifications to its literacy legislation because we're going to learn from implementing. You all are learning things right now in the field, and so legislators will likely come back and make modifications based on what we're learning from practitioners in the field. In addition to probably expecting modifications to come, we saw in Tennessee, for example, that they realized that the provisions around K-3 students didn't go quite far enough, and so they added provisions for pre-K students in terms of advanced screening. And then in North Carolina, as I mentioned, with an extra year for professional development, we saw some indications that they were trying to incentivize that professional development because their statutory requirement is so extensive of 180 hours of professional development. And so the need for professional development incentives as we go on in implementing this legislation may arise here in Virginia. It's a trend worth following. And in terms of promising practices that we found that Virginia might want to pay attention to from these 3 comparable state enactments, one is the potential for having a deep review of district plans and facilitated regional and virtual professional development. Again, we saw in Arkansas a really determined and committed advancement of professional development. We know that there's been a lot of professional development underway at the school division level all summer long and at VDOE level as well. And so we've just seen from these comparables that that's going to be something that's going to continue and deepen that commitment to professional development in order to execute well on this legislation. In Tennessee, we saw an additional round of funding that was put in place to provide literacy development resources and training to support effective enactment of the legislation. And in North Carolina, we've seen the alternatives to standardized testing as a measure that's being discussed and looked at more closely. For example, student reading portfolios instead of the standardized state test there. And so we think these are practices to pay attention to here in Virginia. And as y'all are rolling things out, I'm sure state legislators would love to hear about those experiences to see if these might be practices that make sense for us here.
Thanks, Kim. Now Mike will share about science of reading research.
Hi, good afternoon. Glad to be here. Mike Rusko, I'm a retired elementary principal and currently work part-time as a VTSS systems coach, working to implement PBIS and RTI at different divisions and schools around the state. What is the science of reading? We get into that. As you look at the different bills, you'll see different names pop up: evidence-based literacy instruction, science-based reading research. Our own SOLs say that the science of reading is colloquially named phonics. You could say it's the science of reading Facebook, but what we considered it as we looked at the literature is what is that really high quality reading research that tells us how children learn to read and what are the most effective practices in teaching students to read. So with that, we looked at the in brief, we looked at the background literature on reading. So, and then we'll talk about how that translates into the VLA. To start with, we looked at two models, two well-known models, the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope. There are other models of reading, but these are very well known and really are easy to understand and help us conceptualize how reading comes together for students. The simple view has been around for a long time and tells us that language comprehension and word recognition help develop reading comprehension, but then Scarborough breaks that down even further, and that's how we arrange the lit review in the brief that you can look at, and it's going to provide far more detail. And that's showing how the different strands go into language comprehension and word recognition work together to build skilled readers. Look at word recognition first off. The first component is phonological awareness, which is recognizing, manipulating spoken languages, really getting that speech, sound, syllable knowledge together for students. We move on to phonics, and phonics is the process of connecting those speech sounds, phonemes to letters or letter patterns. And finally, word recognition is component is fluency, which is combining all those things to read quickly with accuracy, speed, and expression. Now, one of the things we talk about is phonics has kind of been the star of the science of reading because that's what's generated a lot of the interest and discussion. It's far from the only thing, as there are many dimensions as to what goes into learning to read. But one of the concerns was in past instruction, explicit sequential phonics had not been included. And that's one of the things that the VLA does is really make sure that programs that are used in training includes how to use explicit sequence phonics instruction. And a lot of this goes to the errors of the past. If you've ever listened to Sold a Story, you know, we want to get away from some of those practices that were widespread, but were not that effective. Use of the 3 cueing system, balanced literacy, whole language, and the problems associated with that, and to a certain extent, leveled literacy and leveled readers. On the other side is the more complex way things come together in terms of the language comprehension piece. And we know that knowledge and vocabulary are critical. Your prior knowledge, when you start to read something, is essential in helping you build understanding. Your knowledge of vocabulary is critical too. The more vocabulary you understand in that passage, the more likely you are to be able to gather understanding of it. Next, we have language and text structures, description, sequence, comparison, cause and effect. And finally, the metacognitive piece, which is that mental reasoning, strategy, instruction, establishing a purpose, recognizing text structures, self-questioning, making inferences. Now, where this gets difficult to sometimes follow in the research is there's a lot of overlap. Is knowledge of text structures prior knowledge? Is it not? Some people consider inference to be the glue of reading and is kind of broken out on its own. Other people include it under strategies. How many strategies are there? But we know these things all work together and are essential in students learning how to read. What that does do, however, is make language comprehension somewhat difficult to assess. We can know that a student is struggling with reading comprehension, but there are a lot of reasons as to why. Maybe they don't lack the foundational skills. Maybe they don't have the knowledge or vocabulary. They don't have any strategies. So it's a complicated mix of all these factors that really help students learn how to understand what they read. So what happens with this research? Basically, one of the things that the research was used for was to identify the key areas of literacy, and you'll see that in how programs were evaluated. Basically, Virginia developed rubrics to evaluate core literacy programs, supplemental and intervention programs, and evaluated each of these programs against what went into the rubric, which should be the science of reading and what we know about reading, to determine whether or not these materials are evidence-based and high-quality literacy instruction. So we had phonological and phonemic awareness, which later becomes foundational skills for grades 4 and 5. We also made sure that phonics and word study were included. Again, those become more foundational skills. And one critical part about phonics is students need to crack the code, but how much phonics do you need? One of the important things is not to get too hung up on phonics and to make sure that once students are successfully starting to decode, that you move on to meaning-based instruction. Fluency is another critical area, making sure that students have sufficient materials to practice and improve their fluency and their rate and their automaticity. Building vocabulary, teaching words, teaching word learning strategies, making sure kids read a lot, because we can't begin to teach all the vocabulary that's needed to advance from one level to the next. Even though we could have a robust vocabulary program, students need to read, and that's how they learn a large amount of their vocabulary. And finally, developing comprehension and background knowledge. One of the things that you'll see in these programs is we know knowledge is important, and some of the core reading programs in particular really try to weave knowledge building into their presentation and their reading materials. And they vary greatly in how intentional they are and how much the program is focused on that. A couple of other things to consider that, of course, then there's writing, which is critical and helps make it all work and an essential skill. And these were the areas that the programs were evaluated on. Two things that we really didn't get into that much that I think are important, though, is volume of reading and motivation to read and getting kids to read. There's a good case to make that the reason scores have dropped is because kids don't read as much as they used to. Now, scholastic book sales are way down. Could be a reflection of students not reading. Again, we talked about the research giving us those areas of reading, and we'll go now into how those translate into the core instructional program.
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everybody. I'm Joan Rhodes. I'm the program coordinator for early and elementary education programming at VCU, and also the faculty director of educator preparation. And I work on accreditation through that role. So one of the most important aspects of the Virginia Literacy Act is aligning the curriculum with the key areas of literacy learning that Mike just went over, and evidence-based literacy instruction and scientifically based reading research. As the VDOE prepared for adoption, they worked with choosing curriculum, and they needed to create a predetermined list of instructional materials that we knew would meet the EBLI and SBRR criteria. And so schools across the state need to use these selected materials, or they are also able to submit an alternative program, but I haven't heard of any school system doing that yet. And so one of the things that the state did in working with the Virginia Literacy Partnership at UVA was to use a two-phased approach to selecting instructional programming. And so they created rubrics, as I think Mike mentioned earlier, that looked at the different qualities they expected to be in the materials and rated programs against that. And so as they did that, they looked at the 5 key components of literacy, and they selected 10 programs to serve students in grades K through 5. What was important And I think an impetus for a lot of this change was the National Council of Teacher Quality report that was released in 2024. And it indicated that states needed to require districts to select these high quality reading curricula. And they also suggested that the science of reading be aligned with teacher preparation programs. So within this report, Virginia was a star because we were one of 9 states across the country that actually required school districts to look at these types of programs and select from a required list. But we were also only one of 3 states that required the funding be provided to purchase the materials themselves. And so we know that our state is really looking out for us as we start to implement these curricula into our classrooms. So in March of 2024, VDOE assisted us by providing an implementation playbook. And this is designed to help us accelerate the adoption, purchase, and implementation of the high quality instructional materials. So this playbook is a framework for our decision-making as we start working with students and start implementing the curriculum this year. The playbook asserted that Virginia teachers were using commercially available materials or homemade activities and online resources when providing a literacy instruction. So by selecting these 10 core quality materials, we know that these previous materials that we were using would be replaced by this. These materials are carefully designed, coherently built, and the content builds on each earlier foundation from the previous year, but also within each year itself. So while we were looking at the core instructional programs that were selected, we noticed that there were some major similarities across the programs. In the first one, they were all high quality. They all addressed the EBLI, SBRR instructional requirements, and they had excellent materials for teaching phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. Additionally, number 2, Mike mentioned this as well, that they followed knowledge building or a content literacy approach where we incorporate language development along with building background information and creating background experiences for our students. And 3, almost all the programs except for one were reviewed by a third-party research group called Ed Report. And this is a nonprofit group. And if you look online and in our report, you can get a link out to this. 8 of our selected 10 programs fully met the requirements for science-based alignment. 2 of them partially met it, and then there was 1 program that wasn't evaluated. But lots of strong similarity across all the programs, regardless of which one you selected in your school system. So the other thing that happened is we found some differences between these core instructional programs. And these are things that you'll want to keep in mind as you're implementing this year. The first one is that some of the programs needed supplementation. In some cases, foundational skills needed to be practiced more often than were in the program itself, or additional vocabulary or high-frequency word instruction needed to be included. Secondly, there was a challenge reported to allocating time to implement all of the parts that were outlined in the manuals. In one case, it was suggested that teachers would have to select the things that they wanted to accomplish because there was more provided in the program than could be done within a school year. Third, there were different levels of guidance for teachers, both in whole group and in small group lessons. And finally, some programs used level readers and or suggested the use of running records. It's noted that the VLA specifically does not allow the use of the 3 queuing systems that many of us used in our previous practice. And so I'll let Dave follow up with takeaways and recommendations.
Thanks, Joan. So there's a lot that we looked at in this brief, and we tried to distill our 5 biggest takeaways and recommendations that we wanted to offer, and these are detailed even further in the report. But the first takeaway and recommendation is that because literacy research is continuously updated, the VLA should be as well. So we tried to focus on recent research for this report as much as possible, but as new findings emerge in these fields, it's important for policymakers to stay up to date on those changes and update the VLA legislation accordingly. Virginia is in kind of an advantageous spot because of the recency of this policy compared to some other states that are implementing it. But just to keep committed to the idea that this research is constantly updating, including by people who are in this seminar right now who are focusing on these things in their research. So we need to make sure that this policy is continuously updating as well. Second update or second takeaway is that trend data from Virginia, as in similar states, may not directly reflect the impacts of the VLA. Kim talks about this all the time about kind of the challenges of assessing the actual impact of policy because sometimes the impacts might be direct, sometimes they might be indirect. So any state level trend data that's reported after VLA implementation, it needs to include clear guidance on how to actually interpret the outcomes because some of those outcomes might be directly related to the VLA implementation, and it might be that there's other outcomes that are not associated with it. For example, the impacts of COVID-19, there's still residue from that. And so it might be that we're just starting to see some of those effects tapering off, and there might be some gains that occur just because of that, but it could also be because of implementation of the VLA. And it was similar to other states that we looked at. The third is that additional staffing might be necessary to fully execute the VLA. So there's requirements related to the number of literacy or reading specialists per student. So there was 1 reading specialist per 550 students, but divisions should make decisions about the number of reading specialists that they hire based on evidence-based strategies and specifically related to supporting students in their school context. And we looked at that a little bit in this brief about how this varies based off of school context as well. So for example, what does this look like in higher poverty schools to make sure that there's fidelity to the requirements? Fourth takeaway is that teachers are going to need high quality ongoing professional development. This is something that's been referred to a couple of times. So this is an additional load on teachers. It could contribute to burnout. Teachers already have enough on their plates. And so therefore, we need to make sure we're offering relevant professional development and time for implementation. That's not only important for successful program implementation, but also for teacher retention, among all the other things that they're navigating right now. And then finally, our fifth takeaway is that Virginia school divisions will need time, resources, and support. So this is something that's being implemented fully this year. School divisions across Virginia also need to consider, the dramatic shifts in instruction that this VLA is going to actually potentially cause. Schools need enough time and runway to be able to acclimate to the change before concluding how effectiveness the program is or isn't that's been selected by the different divisions. And so state, school, and division leaders should help to ensure public understanding that some of the outcomes that we might be expecting related to the VLA may not be immediate, right? So just making sure that we keep that in mind as well. There's a lot more to say about this, and we definitely invite you to take a look at the research brief that's linked here at this QR code. You also have access to it in the resource document. We call it a research brief, but it is a couple of dozen pages. So there's a lot of good information in there. And we're going to continue to have conversations about this throughout the rest of this seminar, and eager to stay in touch about your work related to this as well. But I'm going to now transition and hand this over to Taylor Snow from Henrico County Public Schools to talk about what this implementation has looked like in Henrico that's been doing this for over a year now. So Taylor, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite you to take it away.
All right. Thanks, David. I will go ahead and share my screen and get ready for, just because I've got just a couple kind of visuals to share with you all. Let's see. There we are. Great. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. David, is everything coming? Does it look like a presentation on the screen now? Great. So yeah, I just kind of want to introduce myself, not really for any other reason than as a means to kind of give you a sense of the context in which I'm sort of sharing this information. I am the director of secondary teaching and learning in Henrico, so I work with 6 through 12. And obviously, the Virginia Literacy Act, while still philosophically part of one big piece at both the elementary and secondary level is the same thing. The implementation has looked very different. Those of you who work with secondary know that at the high school level, where we're not really, the state hasn't shared sort of specific mandates with us about what we must be doing, or we're not talking about reading plans or adopting curricula at the high school level, but there are certainly echoes of the act and things that we have done to align our practice with the tenets of the Virginia Literacy Act. But then also at the middle school level, there have been a lot of changes and shifts, regardless of whether there was a mandate to adopt a new approved curriculum, changes to intervention, among many other aspects of the act have been a real seismic shift for us. And really, the overall sort of takeaway of what I'm going to share about our journey in Henrico is from a framing perspective. Yes, this is a lot of work. Yes, this is a lot of changes. There are a lot of resources involved. There are some seismic shifts to not just like what we're talking about when we're talking about reading instruction, but the way we are sort of conceptualizing time during the school day, right? The way we're our emphasis around small group instruction. Just there's nothing in education that it hasn't, in Virginia education, I guess, that it hasn't touched. So because of that, when we talk about the Literacy Act, we're not just talking about sort of pockets of instruction or a literacy block during the day. We're talking about instruction broadly. And not only has that, I think, helped us ensure that what we're implementing is being done with fidelity, but I think it's also helped us get buy-in from a very wide array, broad array of stakeholders. So I'll just kind of jump in and just kind of share that from the jump, our entire premise, and Dr. Bridges is much more versed in this than I am, but anytime you're talking about the type of expenditures that the Literacy Act requires, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be built with boards of supervisors, school boards, with governance, right? Because again, we are asking folks, many of whom do know education very well, but some of whom, especially at the board of supervisors level, they're not pedagogy experts, right? So, and they have a sense of what school was for them, and what we're sharing about reading instruction is quite different. So, so for us in Henrico, it was about framing all of our asks, all of the shifts that we were doing to our strategic plan. And I've got up there sort of the strategic goals and objectives. And this slide comes straight from a board update that we did with our school board, just to kind of to frame the changes that we're talking about with the Literacy Act within the work that we're already doing. Because that's the thing with this too. Every single, all of our divisions are, and regardless of how politicized certain issues have become in education, the Literacy Act isn't really one of them, right? It passed unanimously with broad support from both sides of the aisle. So this is one of those things where you don't really have to navigate political pitfalls. You just have to sort of point out how this is good for students. Like, this is going to help students read, and at the end of the day, being able to point to something that is good, that we know from evidence that it is going to be good for all students, I would hope becomes, and I say I would hope, I know for us it became a pretty easy sell. We have a board that's very supportive of this work, and I would hope the same for all the divisions represented here. But the broad takeaway, anchoring the changes that you're asking for to your broader work, the work that you've already been doing, the mission and vision you've already established, is a great place to start. And then I'm just going to kind of walk through a few sort of specifics as to what both the VLA mandated and then how we decided to go about addressing those. So the first piece is around the Literacy Act mandated division literacy plans. We're told by the Literacy Act that we have to post our literacy plan on our website. We were given a template for the division literacy plan from VDOE. That template pointed largely to, how are you going to get the training done? How are you going to adopt the curriculum? What do these sort of individual, really kind of process pieces look like? We did that and have that template and have that plan shared on our website. But as going back to 2020, we adopted as a division-wide literacy plan, already aligned with the science of reading, already focused on evidence-based literacy instruction that was that was aligned to our entire K-12 division literacy approach. So doing that, having a not just the Literacy Act tells us to do this, so we're going to do this, but having a division philosophy around why literacy matters, right? We talk a lot about durable skills, and that's sort of a new education buzzword, but reading is kind of like is the most important one. I'll go out on a limb and say that in terms of durable skills, reading is the most durable. So having a division-wide philosophy and approach around literacy has been vital for us. It's something that we can kind of lean back on for as a curriculum leader. It's an anchoring point for the work that we do and the things that we develop. So we have those literacy plans working in tandem, right? It's not like the DOE plan came out and we said, all right, take what we have down, let's add something else. No, the idea was to have them sort of be there as complementary plans. Obviously, staffing is another huge shift that has occurred as part, and folks before me spoke to those changes much more eloquently. But in order to hit the staffing demands of the Literacy Act, we found that broadly at the elementary level, we needed to add about 20 additional reading specialists that would bring us to a point where we had a 1-to-1 reading specialist to school ratio. And at the elementary level, the role of those specialists is largely aligned to not just being the literacy specialist in the building, but coaching literacy instruction best practices among all of our teachers. So at the elementary level, those reading specialists are, yes, performing the job of reading specialists, and they are doing progress monitoring, but they're also, for about 50% of their time, performing the role of coaching so that their impact and their expertise can be multiplied across an entire school and not just in their classroom. Whereas at the middle school level, because our focus is really on intervention specifically, and for us, it was a really good, and I would hazard a guess that in a lot of divisions, for a long time, intervention has looked like double blocking. So we're gonna, if 90 minutes of tier 1 instruction is good, then 180 minutes of tier 1 instruction is better. And we do a lot of that, and I know in some divisions and in some contexts it's worked really well. But what we came to the conclusion of is that's not really intervention. Just providing a lot more broad tier 1 instruction for students wasn't doing what we needed in terms of intervention. So this being able to hire these 10 reading specialists for our middle schools allowed us to basically say these are the people who will be teaching the reading intervention blocks in these specific schools, and we did that in a tiered way. Not every student has room for that student in a literacy foundations course. Our literacy foundations course is focused on the students who most critically need the literacy intervention, and all of the work in that literacy intervention class is driven by specific student needs. And if those coalesce in sort of small groups so that those reading specialists can work with groups of 3, 4, 5, great. And as those of you who are reading specialists who have a literacy background, that is sort of how that works. But this also allows, having this position allows these reading specialists to push in and work with students individually who maybe aren't in the literacy foundations class, or pull students as part of a different part of the school day to receive sort of more specific targeted interventions. And just like with our elementary reading specialists, to perform that progress monitoring role. Not that our classroom teachers or core classroom teachers aren't doing that progress monitoring as well, but having our reading specialists shoulder some of that load, what we think is going to be really critical, because as David has pointed out, there's a lot here that is one more thing, right? And we, those of you who work at the division level, you hear a lot of like, this is one more new thing. This is one more new thing. So to be able to use our specialists to help with that progress monitoring work has been really important and has gone over really well in terms of just the perception of their work. So as to the curriculum adoption and resources, at the elementary level, we did adopt Benchmark Advance as our core curriculum for K through 5, not making a plug for that product, just kind of giving you a sense of sort of what our path has been. The part about that, though, that made that adoption and that I think will make that transition to a core curriculum like Benchmark a lot easier is that in terms of best practices, what Benchmark brings to the table and what was approved were already a part of what we were doing in terms of our curriculum. So the learning curve was not in terms of best practices shifting, but in the existence of a curriculum that just frankly, and we're all dealing with this, a lot more scripted than maybe what we had before. Not saying it's a scripted curriculum, but I guess it's a lot more prescriptive, and is a lot more specific in terms of what needs to be happening when in the classroom. And for veteran teachers in particular, that can feel very different, right? I'm not saying it's challenging necessarily, but we have heard from teachers who view this as with like a sense of like, well, wasn't what I was doing already working? Why is this replacing what I was already doing? And the VLA gives us a chance to say like, hey, this is required. This is mandated by the General Assembly. And what this does is ensures a baseline level experience for all of our students while still giving you as a classroom teacher the autonomy and the ability to do what you do best and figure out how this is going to work best for your specific students. And for our newer teachers, especially folks who are coming to us from a background that isn't necessarily a teacher prep program, this having a curriculum that is more spelled out has been a huge benefit, because that's what they're asking for. They want more resources. They want something that gives them a clearer path in terms of exactly where they need to go. That's larger than just the VDOE curriculum framework or some of those other resources that historically we may have used to help drive what's happening in the classroom. And then in terms of our supplemental resources and intervention, obviously we're still waiting on those approved lists to come out. We are currently using an intervention platform that was offered as part of the VDOE All-In initiative. Lexia Power Up was the tool that we used for that, and that's one that we've stayed with and are waiting to see, as all divisions are, what comes out in the wash in terms of the supplemental resources and interventions. And then just a little more, again, I've talked about the adoption of benchmark. One thing I neglected to add to that last slide that is here, and I talked about what this looks like at the high school level. The goal throughout, because of our division literacy plan, was not simply to look at reading as something that happened that like is a K-8 thing and then not do anything to also manage our house at the 9 through 12 level. And I think David mentioned this earlier. Multiple folks have. Mike mentioned it earlier. Sorry, is that there's also an imperative for there just to be volume of reading and volume of writing. I saw a note in the chat that popped up, but didn't get to read the whole post regarding writing being critical. And across all of our contents, it is the expectation at all of our schools, but especially at the high school level, if we're talking about Literacy Act impacts, that students are reading and writing in class, all classes, every single day. That image of the knot where we have comprehension and word recognition sort of meeting. Our goal is to strengthen that connection, not just in English classes, but across the board. And that expectation at the secondary level, particularly the 9 through 12 level, but obviously also 6 through 8, that reading and writing is happening on a daily basis is what the Literacy Act looks like as we kind of extend it forward. Obviously, training is another huge part of this. We've started training and onboarding our specialists as soon as we had reading specialists, just in terms of what our approach was going to be to supporting the Literacy Act. The thing here that I think stands out and that I think is helping drive at least a baseline level of alignment, especially for a large division like ours, we have over 70 schools, is that these reading specialists are supervised at the division level. So the expectations are common across the division. And what that means is that at the middle school level, interventions are the same across the division because they're being supervised by our middle school reading specialist, who's amazing. And at the elementary level, we have the same expectation where all the coaching that they're doing is driven by division-wide coaching role profile and division-wide approach to elementary literacy intervention. And that's supervised by an amazing elementary school reading specialist. So While I'm not knocking sort of site-based supervision, at least for where we are in the process now, division-based supervision I think is working really well for us, and is something that that has made these seismic shifts that the Literacy Act calls for a lot more manageable. We've done the same with our principals, obviously giving them a sense of what it is they need to be, what they need to know, and how that impacts their leadership. I should note also that letters training has been happening in an ongoing manner across our division since prior to the Literacy Act. The literature on letters as effective professional learning, predates all of the predates the Literacy Act. So, if you're looking at trying to find an approach to professional learning that's going to drive outcomes, I mean, letters has been that approach for a long time. So we've been systematic about getting our elementary folks trained and our principals trained using the letters approach. So, and that will continue to be ongoing. And then, of course, we do have the additional Canvas modules that have been shared by Virginia Literacy Partners. There was a question, I guess, a comment earlier as to incentives for professional learning. That is something that, as a division, for specific groups, we did make the decision that we're gonna compensate people for their time completing those modules. I can talk more in a breakout group about sort of what that has looked like as well. But yeah, incentives are important, especially at a time when it's much more of a seller's market than a buyer's market in terms of teachers and bringing people to the profession. So that's a reality that we had to operate under when we're thinking about training and that approach with the Canvas modules in particular. Then in terms of individualized reading plans, again, working on that through our reading specialists in collaboration with classroom teachers, using this incredible amount of data we have to actually to be able to paint a picture for teachers, for families, about not just where students are in terms of their reading, but specifically what skills need to be developed to push that student's reading performance forward. And again, this is one of those things where zooming in, this is a huge lift in terms of the effort involved in individual student reading plans. Zooming out, knowing specifically what individual students need to develop as readers and monitoring those things is hard to argue with. Understanding the work involved, understanding the effort involved. I don't know what the argument is against individualized attention upon student reading needs. So, we're kind of operating under, again, this assumption that we're going to do what's best for students and let that drive this work. And I think the reading plans have, obviously early in their adoption now, but have a lot of potential to do that and to bring families in and make them and empower them more in their, in what their students are doing. And then just a sense of what our timeline has looked like from core curriculum adoption to sort of where we are now. You can kind of get a sense there, just sort of where we've gone. I'm not going to read that to you, just to kind of keep time, at a premium. And then again, moving on through now with where we have ongoing training in our core curriculum program at the elementary level, optional sort of deeper dives into that work available for teachers as they need it. And then looking at sort of from a VDOE and VLP perspective, how are we going to roll out this additional instructional training for the rest of our folks? All right. And yeah, that is it. I wanted to give everybody just sort of a broad overview and a sense of what our approach has been and, the space that we still have to go. I'm not here to claim in any way that nailed it. Virginia Literacy Act, check. Let's move on to something else. Obviously, this is an ongoing moving target, but I'm super proud of the work that the people in Henrico have done on this from, across the board. Our teachers stepping up to the plate, our specialists stepping up to the plate, and the work that they've done to ease this transition has been really remarkable, and it's just been really fun to be along for the ride.
Thank you so much, Taylor. It's so helpful to see how Henrico is implementing this, and how it kind of extends our understanding of what we learned from the research and policy analysis. And for our remaining time together, what we'd like to do is just have some breakout discussions about this. I'm going to share my screen really quickly just to give you a sense of what those conversations are going to look like. So everybody should have access to this resource document now. Within that resource document on the second page, there's these 6 different topic areas that are really aligned with what we were just discussing. And each one of those has a corresponding link that goes to a document where we're going to be able to have some sharing of questions and then resources related to this. In
David,
your breakout.
your document's not showing up on the screen.
Oh, thank you.
Mine-
Okay. Sorry about that. Let me see if it will work now. Can you see the document now?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. So whenever you click on your document in the resource document, you're going to be able to get access to this. And then everybody should have edit access to all of these documents. So it should be a collaborative process. In a moment, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms and everybody should be able to select into the room that you're most interested in. You're welcome to jump back and forth between those rooms as well for our remaining time together. It's 5:05. I'm going to call everybody back together at 5:25. I'm going to open up the rooms and you should get a prompt to be able to join the room that you're interested in having the conversation. And for those who are joining via the recording right now, we're going to be able to link this document and some of the questions and resources that are shared in the description of the video. So I'll stop recording now and I'll open up the breakout rooms.